On August 28, 1963, Clayborne Carson was a naive 19-year-old attending his very first civil rights demonstration, what we all know today as the March on Washington. But what he remembers most about that day isn't Dr. King's historic speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial, but the people he met. Hitchhiking back home to Los Alamos, New Mexico, Carson couldn't have known that 22 years later, Dr. King's widow, Coretta Scott King, would ask him to edit her late husband's papers. Clayborne Carson is now the director of the Martin Luther King Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. His memoir, Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., was published by Macmillan in 2013. We are honored to have him here as our guest today as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King.
I'm Ben Sawyer.
I'm Bob Crawford, and this is The Road to Now. Well, Ben, here in North Carolina, we had a snowstorm. And the kids were out of school Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday this week, which, good for them. I'm glad that, after having all that time off for Christmas, they got another little winter break in, right? But
right.
It can be hard on the parents.
Yeah, snow days are a different bird whenever you are the parent.
That's right. And so my son, we were getting him ready for bed, and I was telling him he was bummed out. It was Wednesday night. He had to go back to school finally on Thursday, and he was bummed out about going back to school. I was like, well, buddy, you're off again on Monday. And he said, why am I off on Monday? I said, well, it's Martin Luther King's birthday. He said, who's Martin Luther King?
Oh,
and
wow.
So many, he's 5 years old.
Yeah.
And our kids ask us questions, and I always feel unprepared to answer a question like that when it comes, because it always seems to come out of nowhere. And without even thinking about it, I said, well, every person on earth who's ever lived is equal in the eyes of God, regardless of their color, regardless of how smart they are, regardless of how strong or how weak they may be. They're all equal in the eyes of God, and God loves each of us just the same. Martin Luther King taught us that, helped to teach us that. So he was a good man who did God's work while he was on earth.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful, Bob. Is there a better answer?
And he said, okay. And I said, so therefore you don't have school on Monday.
Everything the kid wanted to hear and should have heard.
Yeah, so we were so fortunate last month to speak with Clayborne Carson. Ben, could you tell our listeners a little about his background?
Yes, he is a professor at Stanford. He has been editing and publishing the papers of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which are located partially there. And he's someone who grew up as part of the civil rights movement. And he is someone who both studied and lived this. This is a beautiful thing, to find someone whose own story intertwines with their own professional work. I can't tell you, he was so kind to speak with us, because, this is a guy who has been asked by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s widow to take care of his papers. And in history, there are these figures, that I think are the great Americans, like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King Jr. are probably the three people. I'm trying to think if there's anybody that I admire more in our nation's history. And King is the one who has people who are alive that have connections to him. And to me, it's to be able to speak to someone who was a part of that, it blew me away, I'm glad to share this episode with you guys.
Yeah, it was definitely a fitting tribute to the legacy of Martin Luther King. And we were definitely honored to speak with Clayborne Carson.
Clayborne Carson, welcome to The Road to Now.
Good to be with you.
Talk a little bit about yourself and how you first became involved. You say in your book that you were inspired to join the movement in a lot of ways by Stokely Carmichael initially.
Well, I think for me, I was a 19-year-old who had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, Los Alamos. And so I learned about what was going on in black communities largely through the newspapers. The people who seemed to be doing exciting, very worthwhile things were the freedom riders and the people in SNCC. So when I finally met Stokely Carmichael and shortly before the March on Washington, I was just so excited to see somebody who was actually taking part in that struggle. And I wanted to do that myself. I wanted to be more involved. And I transferred to UCLA, and I found a group, the Nonviolent Action Committee, that was kind of the northern counterpart of SNCC. Their targets were not necessarily segregated lunch counters. There weren't any of those in Los Angeles, but instead getting more jobs, getting better housing. These issues made sense in an urban setting. So in 1965, I started getting very much involved in that. I was arrested a few times. One of the qualifications for being a member of NVAC was a willingness to be arrested. We thought of ourselves as nonviolent but radical nonviolence. We saw ourselves as attempting to disrupt society. For example, trying to achieve jobs by trying to shut down a supermarket that was refusing to hire black clerks. I was also involved in designing the King Memorial in Washington, and from the very beginning, the idea of the memorial, I remember we went to the site where the memorial is now, and we wanted it to be that statement from the I Have a Dream speech where he talks about we've come here to cash a check and demand basically what was promised in the Declaration of Independence, what the United States used to justify its own existence as a nation, and to have Martin Luther King facing the Jefferson Memorial, and with the idea that would be a symbolic, ongoing conversation about the nature of American democracy.
Why do we have a holiday for Martin Luther King? Why would you say? What are the key elements that make him a great American, in your opinion?
I think what made him great was the fact that he was at a crucial period in not just U.S. history, but world history. During the 2 decades after World War II, the majority of humanity gained their basic citizenship rights. In many parts of the world, people were still living under colonialism, fighting for their independence. In the United States, a large proportion of the black population was living under Jim Crow. The right to vote was always in question, the right to enjoy public facilities. So I think that what brings all that together is that in various parts of the world, people were involved in freedom struggles. And King was one of the great symbols of those freedom struggles, along with Gandhi and, later on, of course, people like Nelson Mandela, but certainly one of the greatest symbols of that worldwide freedom struggle.
So how does he get to that point? Because that's the amazing thing. He grows up in the Depression, and what is it that guides him and leads him to becoming this great American and this great world leader in the struggle for civil rights?
Well, I think he would have always been an exceptional Baptist minister, but we're not remembering exceptional Baptist ministers now. I think what set him apart was the fact that he happened to be in Montgomery in 1955 when Rosa Parks ignited the Montgomery bus boycott movement. And that through that accident of history, you took a rather exceptional orator who was also a minister, and transformed him into a civil rights leader. And it turned out that he had the skills needed to inspire people, to mobilize others. So it was just a fortunate confluence of history that brought him together with a great movement. In the same way that perhaps if Gandhi had not been in South Africa in the early 20th century, he would not have had a chance to display his talents. He would have certainly been an exceptional, or maybe not even an exceptional lawyer. But he found his mission.
The thing that you say about being an exceptional minister, I read the first published thing piece that you have on the website for your course, the letter to the letter. It's an op-ed, right, for the Atlanta newspaper, and it's the first thing he ever wrote. And I was like, what if that's the first thing I ever wrote? He's a wordsmith from day one. I mean, I was just telling my wife earlier today after going back over this stuff, I can't read or engage in any way with anything he ever did without feeling inspired. And you see it right there. I mean, just the wordsmithing is incredible. And he also, it seems like he had a sense that he understood he was doing something historic, even from that moment in 1955 in Montgomery.
Yeah, I that is kind of interesting, the way in which his oratorical skills were, of course, noticed, and he won some oratory contests. He grew up in a Baptist tradition where charisma in the pulpit is necessary. You know, unlike other denominations, Baptist congregations can choose their own ministers. So if you don't have that capacity to speak in ways that inspire and enrich the lives of your congregation, you're not going to last very long in the Baptist ministry. They can hire and fire their own ministers.
It's a very democratic process, huh?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why the Baptist denomination attracted the most Black Americans, is that many Black Americans were in predominantly white churches where they had no role in terms of selecting the minister. And so the Baptist church offered a place where Black people could select their own leaders.
You know, this being the Martin Luther King Day episode, you know, what if you could just say, what do you think are the key lessons we could take from Dr. King as we approach, we're well into the 21st century? What would you say, being so familiar with King's work, what do you think he can teach us right now?
I think King's basic lesson was a moral lesson about caring for those who are less fortunate. For him, that was the essence of Christianity, that there was no more important lesson than doing justice to those who are at the bottom levels in society, and that any society is judged on the basis of how it treats the least of these. And I think that that's a moral lesson that all of us need to take in terms of our daily lives, because that gets to the question of, what is our responsibility for homelessness? What is our responsibility for those who are left behind in schools that are more segregated today than they were in 1954? We tend to focus our attention on that which we see, and sometimes society is very good at hiding injustice. We segregate our cities so that most people don't have to ever go through the areas where really poor people live. Most of us never have to face the choice of, do we send our kids to a school many of the people drop out because there's no hope in terms of education. So I think that what he, in his sermons, what he's asking us to do is to look around us and see the need for justice in terms of how people are being treated, and to have that empathy for those less fortunate. To me, that's what religion is supposed to be about. It often isn't. It often gets to do you accept this creed, these religious doctrines? If you do, you're a good person. If you don't, you're a bad person in need of being saved. Well, to me, the test is, what do saved people do about suffering in the world? What do they do about injustice in the world? If they don't have any real commitment to confronting that, it's certainly not a religion I would follow. I often think that if people who are truly religious really brought about a betterment of the world, then people who are skeptical of religion would look at that and say, there must be something really good going on in that church, because they just really create a lot of good in the world.
Right.
And I'd like
That's
to
right.
go there and find out how they're doing that. Instead, there's this kind of intolerance of disagreement. So it gets so focused on what you believe rather than what you do.
The work of the gospel is hard.
I agree. I find myself in the middle of a lot of these conversations, Dr. Carson. I'm glad to hear somebody agree with me on this.
Well, those of us who were brought up in the church, sometimes I think that to even still have that hope that the church could represent that force for good is, sometimes I wonder whether it's too late, and it's not going to happen because, there's so much that we see now in terms of how religion gets identified with those in positions of power and privilege rather than those in need.
There came a point in the civil rights movement. The younger people got frustrated with his brand of nonviolent resistance. Can you, for our listeners, because this is a big part of your book, the early part of your book, guide them through the civil rights movement of Dr. King, as opposed to the Black Panthers and the growing militancy, and the Karenga, the Black nationalism movement, and kind of, I don't think people understand how divided around 65, 66, 67 the civil rights movement got.
Well, I think that part of that is the use of the term civil rights movement. I consider myself part of the movements of the 1960s, and I much preferred the notion of a freedom struggle. If it had simply been a civil rights movement in 1965, it would have ended with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, after that, you do have a right to housing coming up as a major issue in 68. The classic civil rights movement ended in 1965. That was the last major mobilization of people to get civil rights legislation. King and other people felt that the movement was about something broader than that. I think he laid it out in his Nobel Prize lecture in 64. He said, it's not just about getting equal justice as Black people. It's about ending poverty. It's about ending war, ending massive uses of violence. It's about broader issues than simply civil rights reform. Once that got to that level, there wasn't the unifying element of everyone agreeing on what the goals were. The Black Panther Party had their 10-point program, but other groups had their own program of what they thought Black people should be fighting for, and what tactics should be used to fight for it. So I think it's not that surprising that the movement began to move in different directions, and plus that the civil rights struggle was an interracial struggle. It included white people who were also in the freedom rides and went to Mississippi in 64 and 65 and were in part of the Selma to Montgomery March. And for them, too, it was a question of, well, now that we've achieved voting rights legislation, what should be our goal? And for many of them, it became the Vietnam War. So once you look upon yourself as being in a large-scale freedom struggle, it's inevitable that you're going to get a lot of internal divisions about what the goals were.
It's interesting in your book, you talk about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and then other organizations like the Panthers and other black nationalist movements, and how they debated what role whites could play in their movement.
Yeah, that was one of the major debates, and who decides who should lead, and of course those arguments took place even before 65, but after 65 they became much more intense. Because for many people, the freedom movement was a revolutionary struggle. It was a struggle to change American society in a radical way. And I think to some degree, that was King's goal too. Ending poverty is a radical goal. Ending war, and especially on an international scale, that's a revolutionary goal. Sometimes some people feel that those kinds of goals cannot be achieved through nonviolence. King thought they could be achieved through nonviolence.
You've read everything that Dr. King ever wrote, pretty much, I assume. And do you think that he was coming from a kind of a Christian worldview? Is that the way he looked at it? This was literally a movement that was radical in the way that the Gospel of Luke is radical.
Yeah, he points that out in later sermons and in his talks to the SCLC, where he says that Jesus was a revolutionary. And there he's picking up on Howard Thurman, an earlier, who made the argument that Jesus was a revolutionary of his time, that the prophetic tradition is a revolutionary tradition. It was against the empire of its day, the Roman Empire. Now, mainstream Christianity made its peace with the Roman Empire, and actually, once the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as an official religion, that aspect of Christianity got lost. But I think it was there in that prophetic tradition that goes back long before Jesus, and I would suggest continues well after Jesus.
Right, and this is the thing you point out that's so great, and this is, I teach history courses at Middle Tennessee State University, and when I teach my classes, I talk about Dr. King, and the thing, I always tell my students that what we remember and what we forget are oftentimes just as important. And oftentimes when you see the celebrations of Dr. King on Martin Luther King Day, the story we hear almost ends in 65. It almost ends, at that point, and there are 3 more years where he is involved with the labor struggle. He's involved in the war against in the struggle against Vietnam. He's out there, and I make the case to them, he's a civil rights leader, but he's more a human rights leader. He's more for the dignity. And people have forgotten these other years where he got really slandered. He went in the press. I remember there's a beautiful moment where he gets called a communist, and his response for being against the Vietnam War, and his response, and I could never do it justice, in my own voice, but he basically says, well, I'm not a communist, but the question you should be asking is not if I'm a communist, it's with the way that black Americans are treated in this country. Why aren't more young black Americans communists? And so there's this whole thing where it's like he's constantly fighting this. And what do you think? Why do you think it is that obviously it's more convenient to only remember the things that we can all agree upon and not the things we don't with the Vietnam War. But why do you think the celebration tends to dismiss those years?
Well, I think that just taking up that issue, most American Christians have no conception of the social gospel movement. And yet it is one of the most important movements to emerge out of the American Christian church. And it was a mostly socialist movement that criticized American capitalism. The ministers who were part of the social gospel movement at the late 19th century, early 20th century, saw all the problems coming out of capitalism, and they were critical of it. One of the most interesting sermons that he gave at various points in his life was called Communism's Challenge to Christianity. And in that sermon, he said that if Christians were doing their duty as Christians, in other words, being concerned about the least of these, being concerned about issues like poverty, that there wouldn't have been Marxism, that it was the failure of Christianity that led to the development of Marxism and communism. So he saw these as being a challenge to Christians to live up to their faith. For example, he said, I didn't learn about this by reading Das Kapital and other books by Karl Marx. I learned about it by reading the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that many people today miss that point, that there was this very radical aspect of the prophetic tradition. And particularly if you believe that not all the prophets came 2,000 years ago. There have been prophets since then. And then it gives you a different perspective about Christianity and the way in which, how did this freedom struggle against the Roman Empire, how did it turn into a religion of imperialism as opposed to a religion of liberation?
And, that's one of the stories that I think oftentimes we forget in our history. I think that in many ways our national consciousness has dealt with the tragedy of racism and slavery and all of this in our country by trying to relegate the story of racial repression to a Southern story, which allows a lot of people outside of the South to kind of wipe their hands of it. But the types of segregation that were going on, they weren't on the books, but they were there. They were economic segregation, and I remember going to Detroit for the first time, for example, and looking and seeing how segregated Detroit was. And being a Southerner, I think I'd always internalized that lesson, which was like, race was a Southern problem. When I went up there, it became apparent to me that there are all these forms, and they're a lot harder to struggle against, huh?
Yeah, certainly. That was my experience. My father's family came from Detroit, and so I had visited northern cities. I knew the level of segregation. Actually, the first time I was denied the right to enter a restaurant was in Colorado, not in Mississippi. So I knew it was not just a Southern problem, that the intensity of the response, for example, when King came to Chicago, and he said that, in the South, he had never faced mobs quite as vicious as what he received, greeted him when he tried to desegregate the suburbs of Chicago.
Yeah, they flipped cars over, didn't they?
Yeah, flipped cars over, threw rocks at him. He was hit with a brick. He could have been killed in Chicago. And of course, we saw later the mobs in Boston opposing desegregation of the schools.
Right.
I think that one of the elements that I teach about in my class is the 1964 election was the last election in which the majority of white Americans and the majority of black Americans voted for the same presidential candidate. And a large part of that, the reason for that shift, has been conflict over issues like desegregation of schools, issues that affect people in the North as well as the South. One of the tests of just how much you're willing to allow your life to be disrupted is, where do you send your kids to school? Would you, as a white person, live in a predominantly black neighborhood? Those are issues that I think affect people in not just in all parts of the United States, I think all parts of the world. It's one thing to be in favor of social justice, but we part company when it comes to what is necessary to get to that more just society.
Dr. Carson, having been involved in the civil rights movement and from, as a participant, as a journalist, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, what is it that they're doing right, and what do you think that they could be doing better? Well,
I think what they're doing right is the same thing that the people involved in the sit-ins and the freedom rides were doing right. That is, when you see something that's wrong, express your outrage and express it in very strong terms that can't be ignored. That's what protesters have always done. And nonviolent protesters have a whole list of tactics that have been used throughout history to draw attention to the fact that a wrong is being committed. I guess what usually has to follow that, and sometimes it's a very difficult process of going from what I would call expressive protests, where I'm upset about something and I want to show how upset I am, and I'm not going to stop until something is done about it, to what I would think of as instrumental protest, where you have to face the issue of how do you actually bring about the change that you want? How do you specify what that change is? How do you mobilize a coalition of people to bring it about? It's inevitable that the former, the expressive, is easier than the instrumental. It's always going to be that way. Both are necessary. Would we even be talking about police shootings of unarmed people if not for those protests? It's not like that suddenly started happening with Trayvon Martin.
And also the role social media has played, particularly with Black Lives Matter, with videos of literally watching men die, watching men who've been shot by police officers die in front of our face. It's almost as shocking for us with social media, perhaps as it was when television viewers saw the water cannons turned on those walking across the bridge in Selma.
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarities there, because there were people at the time, even with the water hoses and stuff, and saying, well, police have to do something to suppress disorder. And the only thing that really made it different from other kinds of suppression is that it was directed against teenagers, and sometimes kids that weren't even teenagers. So I think with this, you're talking about people who encounter police in their lives, people who get stopped, their car gets stopped. I'm sure, and the verdicts that have come down indicate this, that the way the law is written, it's the perception of the police of danger that is legally decisive. So if you really want to stop this, you have to move toward what are the fundamental things that cause this. And one of them is, do police need to be armed in the first place? In some nations in the world, they don't carry arms, and they actually have lower crime rates than we have in the United States. Or if they are armed, should they be taught to shoot to kill? All of these are policy questions. And those are much more difficult to confront, and they take longer to confront. I applaud the people who are saying, get with it, because it's not necessarily when you are expressing your outrage, you're not obliged to offer the solution. A lot of times you don't know what the solution is, because I'm sure that the people who started Black Lives Matter, they hadn't studied the law about what is a justifiable homicide by a policeman. What is justifiable use of force by police. That's a legal question. And as we see in these trials, it can be a complex legal question because it gets to the state of mind of the policeman and the perception of danger.
And what was amazing about Dr. King was that he would come places and become part of struggles, and he would take that struggle that was local, and take that struggle that the people, say of Montgomery understood, and he would put it within the context of a greater social struggle for justice. He would put it in a historical context. He would give those movements so much more meaning by coming there and his great leadership. And I think that's one of his great qualities. I think if you were looking to a model for leadership, I think that's where I would look.
Well, I think you also have to put that leadership in a broader context of different kinds of leadership. We wouldn't have civil rights acts without the NAACP, who got into the business of lobbying Congress, and when we actually look at what gets written and what gets passed, and when policy making gets done, it's often a complex process where leadership comes at lots of different levels. To me, and as an activist, I understood that the ACLU was helped me get out of some of the trouble I was in for protesting. It was vital, because otherwise I could have ended up spending a long time in jail. For example, handing out leaflets at a train station, which I found out was considered against the law by the policeman who arrested me, but because the ACLU took that to court and took it to the California Supreme Court, they declared it unconstitutional to prevent people from entering a public place and expressing their free speech. So you need different kinds of leadership, and I'm always very conscious of the fact that it's not just the people who are out on the street. It's sometimes people who are 20 years older and have volunteer their legal expertise. Sometimes it's just people donating to a cause. There's lots of different levels of investigative journalists who expose, for example, the series that just appeared in the New York Times about racism in the prison system in New York. That took a lot of work. That took a lot of effort. To me, that's part of the freedom struggle.
Right. We can all do our part.
The things that I don't know if I would go out and shut down a freeway today. Probably not. Things that you're willing to do when you're 21 years old are not necessarily things you would do 20 years later.
My colleague Lewis Woods here at MTSU has written a great article on this about just the blanket denial of GI benefits to black veterans who came back, and the way that was like almost that was built into the system. This segregation for a long time. It took a lot of efforts of the NAACP to finally overturn legalized segregation through that system.
Yeah, and that's a large reason why we are where we are today, where segregation is in some ways more entrenched than it was even in 1954, is that we really haven't challenged the issue of residential segregation. For example, why is it that government housing for low-income people tends to be reinforced segregation rather than break down segregation? It doesn't make any more sense to have a low-income housing in a poor black area than in a middle-class white area. In fact, it makes much more sense to have it in the middle-class white neighborhood, because that will allow kids to go to often newer schools. It would decrease the intensity of segregation. All these things that would happen. But when that was tried, there was enormous resistance to it.
Yes, and for my classes, I have my students read George Wallace's the civil rights sham fraud speech that he gave on July 4th. I think was it July 4th, 1964, I believe it was, where he uses the Declaration of Independence as a justification for why segregation should be legal. And I have them do that because I want them to understand that it's not just people. You can't just go out there and yell that those people are different than us and because of the color of their skin. People who are trying to deny rights to people. And this is what was amazing about Dr. King, is he could tease this out and make this so perfect and make sense. Was that they're not just saying I don't want those people here because of the color of their skin. They're evoking these national documents, these national symbols. And I think the amazing thing is that Dr. King does that too, but he's just way better at it than they are.
Well, also I would say that he is throughout his life he's doing what all great black orators do, and that is point out the hypocrisy of a nation that prides itself on freedom and equality and all the things in the Declaration of Independence, and has always had trouble living up to that.
Dr. Carson, thank you so much for joining us on The Road to Now.
Okay, thank you.
thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Today's show was produced by Bob Crawford, Dr. Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta. Our music is provided, as always, by Paul DeFiglia. And this show was skillfully edited by Nick Corrigan. As always, we really appreciate all your support, all the great reviews on iTunes. Please tell your friends. Be sure and pick up Clayborne Carson's memoir, Martin's Dream, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. It was published by Macmillan Press in 2013. Until next time, take care.